Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Zhang and I'm the founder and host of Undocumented History, an online YouTube video podcast. Welcome to episode 15. On today's episode, I wanted to spotlight history that many people may not know about. The 228 massacre in Taiwan and subsequently the White Terror, which resulted in up to 28,000 deaths. Our guest on today's episode, Grace Hwang Lynch, will be joining us to talk about this history. Not only did her dad live through this moment, but her award winning personal memoir, Salty Like Tears, also details this event. Here is my conversation with her. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Undocumented History, an online video podcast focused on educating others about Asian culture and history, while also amplifying Asian voices and stories. I'm Tiffany Zhang, your host, and today we have a very special guest, Grace. Grace is a freelance writer, editor, and photographer, as well as the Communications and Engagement Director at Center for Asian American Media. She is also the founder of HapaMama, her own blog. Grace, thank you so much for being here today and taking the time to join me. Before we start, is there anything else that you want to add regarding to what you do and who you are?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Tiffany. I'm honored to be here and happy to talk about parts of Asian American history that not everybody knows about. Yeah, as a writer, I find it really important to be inspired by our own lives and our own history and that of the people around us and in our family. So I'm really happy to talk with you.
Yeah, of course. So, the first kind of thing that I wanted to talk about was your piece, Salty Tears. And what kind of initially drew me to asking you to give me the opportunity to interview you was your piece, Salty Tears. So, I guess for anyone who doesn't know, like Salty Tears is a story about one of Grace's trips to Taiwan and about the 228 massacre. And it also won the grand prize winner in the adult category of the Betty L. Yu and the Jin Si Yu Creative Writing Prize. What was like the process of writing the story? Like, did you find it difficult? And I guess like what is some advice that you would give to other writers who also may be writing about traumatic historical events?
Yeah, thank you for reading and for asking about that. So I actually started working on the essay that became Salty Like Tears, probably um, it's been a long time, maybe 5 years ago. And the events that happened, the trip to Taiwan actually happened even before that. So, it took a long time for those events to kind of I just kept thinking about it after that trip to Taiwan. And there was just so much. I've actually been thinking about this event, maybe the whole story since I was a child. As I mentioned, part of the story that I recall in the essay was when I was in middle school. My dad first told me that he had witnessed a massacre in Taiwan. And before that, he had never mentioned anything about this. I didn't know what the 228 massacre was. I had no, just really no context. It was never in any of the books I read. It was never in any documentaries I saw on TV. So it was very shocking to me. And I kind of just put it away in my head because I had not, heard anything. And then as I grew older, there were other times when my father would reference this event that happened. And for people who don't know, the Massacre is an event that happened in 1949 or 1947 in Taiwan. And it was a massacre that happened of people who were pro-Taiwan independence after the arrival of a new government from China. And I just it's something that is not talked about. And there have been several other books or works of art that have referenced it since then, like in the 2010s. But after this particular trip, I just, could never really stop thinking about it and about how symbolic some of the things that happened were and how my father had really wanted to show us some of these landmarks in different places. And I just really kept brewing on it in the back of my head. And as I started doing more personal essay writing and memoir writing. It was something that I just kind of came back to time and time again, and it took many drafts and many, many revisions and sharing the story with many writer friends, reading it and sharing it in a couple of different writing workshops, and really working through it to the point where it became the final product that you can read in this essay on TaiwaneseAmerican.org. So really, yeah, it's a very iterative process. Writing is a very, sometimes it's very fast and ideas just come to you and you want to just like write them all down before you forget them or before that inspiration leaves. But then it can also be a very slow process of editing and kind of going back and revisiting that essay with different eyes, from a different point in your life when you then have maybe some more perspective to look back with a little bit more context or, wisdom about like, as an essay writer, a memoir writer, you want to not just recall events and not just like state a whole bunch of things that happen, but you want to add a layer of reflection to it and think about like, not only did these events happen and they were interesting or they were shocking or they were memorable, but how has that impacted me and how has that changed me? And so I think all of those things went into the process of creating the essay that is finally what you were able to read.
And so, as you mentioned before, the piece that you wrote, Salty Like Tears, is about the 228 massacre. I know you did give us some background to the 228 massacre, but can you talk a little bit more about that, and also the white terror that came after it and your connection to these events, if you wish?
Yeah, so the 228 massacre happened in the 1940s, and it was during a time when there was a lot of strife and unsettledness in Taiwan, and there was a new government that had arrived. The nationalist government had just arrived in Taiwan and was imposing very stringent, like some people would say they were, oppressive or abusive, and definitely, the law was not, was applied especially toward people who were in Taiwan from before this wave had arrived. And so, in this era where things were already kind of a powder keg and tensions were very high, there was an incident that happened where there was a woman who was like a widow with children. She was selling cigarettes on the sidewalk. She was just basically selling things to try to make a little bit of money so she can feed her family. But at that time, they had like a law that required that people had to have like a permit or something to sell things on the street. And, some police went up to her and, demanded to see her permit. She didn't have one, of course. They were harassing her basically. Like, it's actually a very uh, poignant parallel to things that happen, closer to our current time, where there's this feeling that the law is being applied only to certain people, that these like very picky, details are being enforced to people who they want to enforce them to. And then so, some bystanders saw that happening and defended the woman. And in the process of the police trying to curtail the bystanders defending the woman, there was a guard who, I think he like basically pistol whipped one of the people who was trying to defend the woman and killed him. And then so, that sparked, it was just like the match that sparked the tinder that was already ready to go. And then, that spawned multiple days of protests and uprisings, basically, which were clamped down on by basically the just like a very harsh and violent clamping down that either people were taken away to prisons where they were never heard from again, or there were quite a few people just killed, and it's such a undocumented part of history that when you look up history statistics, or you try to find out exactly what happened, it's very unrecorded. So there's an estimated like between 10 and 30,000 people who were killed during this time, right around that event. And then that event then led into the White Terror period, which was basically about 40 years. It lasted until 1987. So you think about, there was a whole generation of people that were raised during this time between 1947 and 1987 who only knew the White Terror in Taiwan.
Hmm. Yeah, and what you kind of talked about, like people who grew up only knowing the White Terror, what kind of impact does that have on like family trauma and on Taiwan still to this day?
Yeah, I think it has a lot of impact. I think that, basically during the White Terror period, people were really afraid to, say anything about, the events of the 228 massacre, or just, any kind of like dissent in general. And then, as I, reference in my story, I kind of imagined what it was like for my father growing up during this period, and what it was like for him to go to a school where, um, teachers would punish kids, with corporal punishment for speaking Taiwanese in class. People were punished or fined just for speaking Taiwanese, the Taiwanese Hokkien language on the street. If a guard were to hear them, and so it was a very very oppressive time, and I think that for the generation that grew up during that era, they just were taught to live in a way that they were not, not only did they not feel free to express dissent, they really didn't feel free to do, a lot of things, to speak to their family in their native language. They couldn't, talk about Taiwan as an entity, as a self-governing nation. There was so much fear that was around, and it was just became a very unthinkable thing. And then, of course, that carried over to people, even when you leave your home country, and those laws may not apply, in your new place where you're living. You might be living in the Midwest in America, but mentally it's really hard to change. And so, people end up of like, people of that generation, that first wave of immigrants that came over as graduate students from Taiwan to the United States, that fear was very much really present, and that sense of really wanted to keep your head down, and not not rock the boat, and not say things that are against the government, was very real. And I think that sometimes people of a lot of Asian immigrant communities, there's this association with like, oh, it's culture that makes people want to maybe not talk about things or keep things bottled up. But it's also really important to note that it's not necessarily like the culture of like your home culture, but it's also the history of things that happened, that shaped that.
Hmm. Yeah, I really like your analysis about how we should also look at the history that shapes the culture, because I think that's so important. And sometimes people just look at culture as to why someone like may be the way they may be, when in fact there's also a history involved in it. And I know you talked about kind of like keeping your head down and not really talking about like stuff, but I wanted to ask you, like, why is it important to like talk and write about undocumented stories like the 228 massacre?
Yeah, I think that, if you are, I think that some people, if you have something in your history or just like something that, sticks with you that you can't stop thinking about, it's really important to share that with other people and to, record it for not only your own family and your own like circles, but also just for like the world at large, so that it can be no longer undocumented history, but that it is actually becoming part of like, history that everybody knows about.
Hmm. Yeah, and making sure that the history is something that everyone knows about. I feel like learning about history isn't like memorizing, like, oh, this event happened in 1947, but more of learning patterns of oppression and censorship so that we can better recognize it and respond to it when similar events like that happen again, which, yeah, as I said, really shows the importance of talking about undocumented stories.
Absolutely. Yes, I think that, that is so important. And then on a personal level, I think it can be really important too, because you know, um, one kind of uh, stereotype, or, maybe it's just, something that happens a lot is that, when in immigrant families, sometimes there's a lot of like disconnect between generations, and people feel kind of unfulfilled because they're not that close to, their parents or their relatives. And knowing more about what happened to your parents or your grandparents can really help to bridge that feeling of not being connected or not being understood. And it can also help you to have more empathy and understanding for your relatives and your ancestors, to know about that. And for other people as well. I mean, I think that there's a lot of other people who, maybe if your parents aren't able to talk about what happened to them, but if you are able to read a story or watch a film, or hear about something that happened to another person who lived a life similar to your parents, then that empathy can cross over and you can have a little bit more understanding of the world that they lived in.
Hmm. Yeah, just like going back to what we were talking about before, like making sure you like understanding your own culture is part of it, but also understanding the history that your relatives or parents went through. And I'm sure like this is kind of just an assumption, but I'm sure you felt maybe an empathy gap being bridged between maybe like you and your dad when you asked him about like the not directly about the Tutu massacre, but when you realized that he had seen a known massacre, like I'm sure that also bridged some empathy gaps. But moving on, I guess why do people and institutions try to censor events like this slash like not talk about these events?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a, I'm not I I'm not, a leader in that way. I think that you can make certain guesses, of why, it's happened, these kind of things happen in history over and over. And I think it just points to the fact that knowing storytelling is powerful, and knowing history is really powerful. And sometimes people are scared of that, of knowing history, like you said, may prevent things from happening again. And,
Mhm.
I think that that is something that raises fear in oppressive governments, because maybe they think that, having the masses know about things would make them feel more empowered, or, having people with the ability to feel the freedom to talk about their own lives and experiences would make them then, too too powerful, and like, the people would be able to like uh have more, have more collective shared ability to pull together, by
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, of course. And I know going back to the 228 massacre, I know, or prior to this interview, I researched a little bit about it. And I know that talking about the 228 massacre was taboo for 48 years, which just like makes me think, like going back to what we said before, that like there's something so powerful about talking about censored events like this, that like even oppressive, like powerful governments are scared of people talking about it.
Yeah, yeah,
And then
totally.
what are some other like undocumented moments in Taiwan's history that people probably do not know about that you know about?
Yeah, that's a hard one because I think, most people in the United States or around the world actually know very little about Taiwan's history. And even, in fact, people who live in Taiwan right now don't know a whole lot because they were mostly raised in this during like the White Terror period or even afterwards. I mean, I think that, for people who were going, educated and going to school, even after the 1980s, like they don't necessarily learn about all of this. For example, in the 1970s, there was another incident called the Kaohsiung incident, where there were some activists who were protesting in Kaohsiung, which is a city in southern Taiwan, and that's another really famous incident that happened. But like even if you go back in time, like I don't know how much you know about the history of Taiwan, but like a lot of people don't really know, like kind of a lot of like how, when did Taiwan become, populated by Han Chinese? Like when did other, European countries come and, establish like colonies or outposts in Taiwan? Like a lot of people don't know that, that there were like over 100 indigenous tribes on Taiwan at one point. And then many of them were unfortunately killed by Han Chinese immigrants who settled in Taiwan. So it's a very complicated history. There's a lot that happened.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it just goes back to what we were talking about before this interview. Like, I was talking about like why the reason why I wanted to start this podcast was because I realized that a lot of like a lot of people in the United States, including Asian Americans themselves, don't know about Asian American history. And I think maybe it points to like a bigger problem just like in schools and maybe the education system about like lack of diversity in education. But I'm glad that I feel like or some schools are taking a more diverse and inclusive approach to making sure like all important history is being learned about.
Yeah, I hope so. Feels like the pendulum is swinging backwards and that there is like we're living in a time of backlash against that. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you're seeing that, you're still in school. Hopefully you are able to, research things on your own and find out things. But, I don't know. Are you seeing the backlash against the, efforts to increase our, diverse education?
I mean, like, yeah, of course, I've like seen the stuff on the news and stuff, but I feel like there are some schools that are still pushing and like resisting the backlash to teach more diverse education, which is good.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I hope
And
so.
then I guess the last question for today is about I know we were talking a lot about your previous story, creative writing piece, Salty Like Tears, but what can we expect or what can you tell us about your upcoming project, which is a memoir and essays about the way food often takes place of words to bridge language and culture gaps?
Yeah, thank you. I think if the essay Salty Like Tears resonated with you, that is very much like what the rest of my book that I'm working about on is about. You know, like you mentioned with, generational trauma and a lot of families not really being able to talk directly about the things that happen to them, or even just to be able to communicate. There's so much that happens non-verbally, and then also like maybe sometimes in my experience, a lot of the things I do learn about my family and my relatives, like they don't just come out and talk about, oh, this thing happened to me, but like little stories, get brought up because they're reminded by something, like they're eating, or maybe if you spend a lot of time sitting around a meal with people, then little bits and pieces start to come out. And that is kind of like that's kind of like the theme of my memoir that I'm working on. And in so many different ways, I think that it spans from history of Taiwan to what it was like for my parents being immigrants in the United States during the 1960s and 70s, when it was a very different time for people to be immigrants from Asia. And, even for myself, like, being a kid and a teenager and then a young person, uh, you know, just navigating the world and living in this world and just trying to find my way.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure like anyone who's watching this and also like me included, like we're all really excited to read your new piece. I hope you send me or I hope that I'll be able to buy your piece. So please let like us know when it's coming out and stuff. And yeah, that's it for the interview. So thank you so much, Grace, for coming on and speaking with me. It was such a pleasure to interview you. And yeah, I guess like, do you have any closing final thoughts or words that you want to say?
Yeah, it's such an honor to be here on your podcast with you, Tiffany. And I would just encourage people that, if you are a uh, emerging writer or storyteller of any kind, that, you really honor that desire within you to tell stories. And, sometimes it's not the easiest path, and you may encounter people in your life who, discourage you from, talking about things that are kind of uncomfortable or inconvenient. But I would encourage you just to, stick with it, and to really trust your instincts, and to really follow that desire to be a storyteller.
Of course, and as we were talking about before, like storytelling is very powerful and it's important to talk about the untold stories. So, yeah, on that note, thank you so much to everyone listening and watching, and I will see everyone next time. Bye.